Hello, beautiful soul. I'm Aurora, and welcome to Twin Flame Journey, a space where we explore the deeper meaning behind soul connections, divine timing, and the path that leads two hearts back to union. If you've been feeling the signs, you're in the right place.
There's something people rarely talk about when it comes to deep intimacy. Not attraction, not chemistry, not even love. I'm talking about that uncomfortable moment when a man realizes someone has seen parts of him he's spent years hiding even from himself. And strangely, that realization doesn't always make him move closer. Sometimes it makes him disappear. Sometimes it makes him colder. Sometimes it makes him stare at his phone at 1:17 in the morning, reading the same conversation again, telling himself he's fine. I've watched this happen. I've lived it. And if I'm honest, part of me still doesn't fully understand it. Because deep intimacy doesn't simply make a man feel loved. It unlocks things. Memories he forgot. Needs he buried. Fears he thought he outgrew. It exposes the strange contradiction inside him. The desperate desire to be fully known. And the equally desperate urge to ruin the moment that actually happens. This isn't a story about perfect men. It's not a story about enlightened relationships. It's about what quietly starts happening inside a man when someone reaches a place in him that nobody else ever reached. And what he often does next, even when it's the last thing he wants. I don't think most men notice the exact moment it happens. At least I didn't. People imagine these things arrive dramatically. A life-changing conversation, a confession, a kiss, a grand realization. But from what I've seen, and honestly, from what I've lived, it usually starts somewhere embarrassingly ordinary. A random Tuesday, a message that wasn't particularly important, a joke that shouldn't have stayed in your head as long as it did. That's the strange thing. When something is becoming emotionally significant, it rarely announces itself. It just quietly starts taking up more space. And for a while, he doesn't notice. Or maybe he notices and pretends he doesn't. There's a difference. I remember one night sitting in my car after work. Nothing dramatic had happened. No argument. No deep conversation. No relationship milestone. I had just parked outside my apartment. The engine was off. The radio was off. And somehow 20 minutes passed. I was just sitting there, thinking about something she had said 3 days earlier. 3 days. Not because it was profound. Actually, if I repeated it now, it would probably sound ridiculous. She had laughed at something and said, "You always pretend you're less tired than you are." That was it. Nothing poetic. Nothing life-changing. But it stayed. Because she was right. And I hated that she was right. Not enough to admit it. Just enough to think about it repeatedly. That's usually how it starts. Not with love. Not with certainty. Just attention. The kind of attention that lingers longer than it should. The kind that keeps returning when you're trying to focus on something else. At first, he doesn't call it anything. He tells himself she's interesting, different, fun to talk to, easy to be around. Whatever explanation feels safest. Anything except the real one. Because the real one is uncomfortable. The real one is, why am I thinking about this person when she's not here? And once that question appears, things start getting complicated. Not externally, internally. Because something shifts before behavior changes. Before labels. Before decisions. Before conversations. The body knows first. I've noticed that. The body always seems to know first. His phone lights up. His chest reacts before his mind does. A tiny rush, barely noticeable. Then he sees the name and immediately acts normal. Or tries to. Sometimes he waits before responding, not because he's busy, because suddenly he cares, which creates a strange kind of self-consciousness. Now every response feels slightly more important. Not important enough to admit, just important enough to overthink. He'll type something, delete it, type something else, delete that too, then send the first version, the one he originally wrote 30 seconds ago. And afterward he'll laugh at himself. Because why did that take 5 minutes? It's just a text. Right. Except it isn't anymore. And that's the problem. I think one of the first signs is when casual interactions stop feeling casual. You start remembering details. Tiny details. The kind that shouldn't matter. Her coffee order. The story about her cousin. The song she mentioned once. The thing she always says when she's nervous. You don't intentionally memorize these things. They just stick. And that can be unsettling, especially for men who are used to keeping emotional distance. Because distance feels predictable. Distance feels manageable. Then suddenly you're standing in a grocery store looking at some random snack she likes. And for a split second you think, she'd probably buy this. Then you immediately move on. But the thought happened. And that's what matters. The thought happened. Nobody talks about those moments. Those tiny emotional betrayals. The moments where your own mind starts revealing things you're not ready to acknowledge. Sometimes it shows up in routines. You check your phone more often. Not consciously. Just automatically. Then one day you catch yourself doing it. You unlock the screen. Nothing. Lock it. 30 seconds later. Unlock it again. Nothing. And now you're annoyed. Not because she hasn't texted. Because you've realized you're waiting. Waiting feels vulnerable. Most men hate realizing they're waiting. Because waiting means someone matters. And once someone matters, there's risk. Risk changes everything. I think that's why some men become strangely cold or right when feelings start developing. People misunderstand this. They assume coldness means lack of feeling. Sometimes it means the exact opposite. Sometimes emotional investment creates panic. Not dramatic panic. Not movie panic. Real panic. The subtle kind. The kind that looks like withdrawal. Distraction. Overworking. Taking longer to reply. Creating unnecessary distance. Not because he wants less connection. Because he suddenly realizes how much he wants it. And that realization makes him uncomfortable. I've watched men do this. I've done this. Someone gets closer, and instead of moving toward them, you start mentally looking for exits. Not because they're wrong. Not because you are unhappy. Because something feels real. And real things can hurt. That's the embarrassing truth. People like to imagine emotional avoidance is complicated. Sometimes it's painfully simple. Sometimes someone matters. And that terrifies you. I remember another moment. A completely forgettable conversation. At least it should have been forgettable. We were talking about nothing. Literally nothing. Laundry. Work schedules. Something dumb we saw online. Then there was this silence. A few seconds. Not awkward. Just quiet. And for some reason I didn't want to leave. The conversation had already ended. There was nothing left to say. But I kept finding reasons to stay. One more question. One more joke. One more topic. Anything. And afterward I remember sitting there thinking, that's new. Because I wasn't staying for the conversation anymore. I was staying for her. That realization hit harder than I expected. Not because it was romantic. Because it was undeniable. Those moments are difficult to explain. They're small, invisible. Nobody watching would notice. But internally they feel enormous because they're evidence that something has changed. And once you see it, you can't fully unsee it. Of course, this doesn't mean he immediately becomes emotionally available. Sometimes the opposite happens. Sometimes awareness arrives long before readiness. That's where things get messy, because now he cares. But he doesn't necessarily know what to do with that. Part of him wants more. Another part immediately starts calculating consequences. What if this gets complicated? What if I lose myself? What if this doesn't work? What if she sees things about me I'd rather keep hidden? The strange thing is that these questions often appear long before any actual problem exists. Fear loves hypothetical situations. Fear is creative like that. So, while everyone else thinks everything looks normal, an entire private debate is happening inside him. A debate nobody hears. Not even her. Especially not her. Because men often hide the emotional shift while it's happening. Not always intentionally. Sometimes they don't fully understand it themselves. They just know something feels different. Something feels heavier, more significant, more dangerous, more alive. And if you asked him directly, he'd probably minimize it. He'd probably say, "It's not that serious." Maybe he even believes that, partially. But then later that night he'll replay a conversation, or stare at a message longer than necessary, or smile remembering something completely insignificant. And that's usually the giveaway, not the words. The behavior, the little things, the unconscious things, the moments where his actions quietly reveal what his mouth refuses to say. Because the truth is, deep intimacy rarely begins when someone falls in love. It begins much earlier. It begins the moment another human being starts feeling emotionally present in places that used to belong only to solitude. And for a man who has spent years carrying parts of himself alone, that realization can feel beautiful, and uncomfortable, and relieving, and terrifying. Sometimes all in the same day. Sometimes all within the same hour. And that's usually the moment it stops being casual. Even if nobody says it out loud. Even if he spends months pretending otherwise. I think a lot of people misunderstand what scares men. They assume it's rejection. Being told no. Being left. Being unwanted. And sure, those things hurt. Nobody enjoys rejection. But if I'm being honest, there's something that has frightened me more than rejection at certain points in my life. Being accurately seen. Not admired. Not desired. Seen. There's a difference. A huge difference. Because admiration lets you control the image. Being seen takes that control away. And I don't think most men realize how much of their lives are built around maintaining certain versions of themselves. The capable version, the calm version, the independent version, the version that doesn't need much, the version that's doing fine, even when he isn't, especially when he isn't. The strange thing about deep intimacy is that eventually it starts slipping past those versions. Not aggressively, not intentionally, just naturally. And one day she notices something. Something small. Something you never explained. Something you hoped nobody would pay attention to. And suddenly you're uncomfortable. Not because she's wrong. Because she's right. I remember a moment that shouldn't have mattered. We were sitting together after a long day. Nothing serious. Nothing emotional. At least that's what I thought. I was quieter than usual. Not upset. Just tired. The kind of tired you don't talk about because it sounds dramatic if you try to explain it. The kind that has nothing to do with sleep. She looked at me and said, "You always get quiet when you're carrying too much." That was it. One sentence. No therapy language. No deep analysis. No interrogation. Just observation. And I immediately felt irritated, which should have confused me, because she wasn't criticizing me. She wasn't accusing me of anything. She was being kind. But my body reacted before my mind did. My shoulders tightened. My chest felt strange. I changed the subject. I laughed, made some joke, moved the conversation somewhere safer. Later that night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Not because she had said something profound, because she had noticed, and for reasons I couldn't explain at the time. That felt dangerous. I think a lot of men know this feeling. You spend years learning how to present certain parts of yourself, not necessarily because you're fake, because you're practical, because life rewards functionality. People depend on you. Work depends on you. Responsibilities depend on you. So eventually you become skilled at showing people the version of you that can keep moving, the version that can handle things, the version that doesn't require much emotional attention. Then somebody comes along and starts noticing what's happening underneath all that. Not because they're investigating, because they're paying attention. And attention can feel strangely intimate. Sometimes more intimate than physical closeness. I've seen men tell deeply personal stories while staying emotionally hidden. And I've seen men become completely exposed because someone noticed one tiny habit. The way he withdraws when he's overwhelmed. The way his voice changes when he's anxious. The way he suddenly becomes busy whenever something emotional gets too close. Those observations hit differently because they're difficult to argue with, especially when they're accurate. There was another moment I remember. A stupid moment, honestly. The kind of thing nobody would put in a movie because it sounds insignificant. She sent me a message. I saw it immediately. Then I intentionally waited before responding. Not because I was busy. Not because I wanted to play games. I don't even know why I did it. Maybe because I suddenly cared what I said. Maybe because I wanted to seem unaffected. Maybe because vulnerability sometimes disguises itself as delay. A few hours later, she responded. You do that thing where you disappear for a bit when you care about something. I stared at the screen, then laughed, then immediately put the phone down, then picked it back up, then put it down again. Because once again, she was right. And I hated that she was right. Not really hated. That's not the word. Feared. Maybe feared. Because now something private wasn't private anymore. And that creates a strange emotional tension. Part of him feels relieved. Part of him feels exposed. Both can exist simultaneously. Actually, they usually do. That's one of the most confusing parts. People think emotional intimacy feels warm. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it feels like standing in a room where somebody turned on all the lights, and suddenly you become aware of things you'd rather keep hidden. Not terrible things, just human things. Needs, insecurities, loneliness, fear, the embarrassing desire to matter, the embarrassing desire to be chosen, the embarrassing desire to stop pretending you're unaffected. Most men don't talk about that. Not because it isn't there, because it feels vulnerable. And vulnerability can create strange behavior. I've watched men become defensive during moments that were actually loving. I've watched men argue against observations they secretly knew were true. I've watched men pull away after feeling understood, which sounds irrational until you've experienced it. Because understanding creates responsibility. Once someone sees you clearly, it's harder to hide from yourself. That's the part nobody warns you about. Deep intimacy and just seeing another person. It's losing some of your ability to avoid yourself. And honestly, that can be exhausting. I remember driving home one night after spending time with her. The roads were almost empty. Street lights flashing across the windshield. Music playing quietly. And I kept replaying something she had said. Not because it was romantic. Because it irritated me. She had said, "You act like nobody can help you." Simple. Annoyingly simple. At first, I mentally argued with her. That's not true. Of course people help me. What is she talking about? Then 20 minutes later, I realized she wasn't talking about practical help. She meant emotional help. And suddenly I couldn't stop thinking about it. The worst part, I knew exactly what she meant. I just didn't want to admit it. That's another thing that happens when a man feels deeply seen. His arguments become weaker, not externally, internally, because the truth starts leaking through. The explanations stop working. The defenses stop feeling convincing. And for someone who has relied on those defenses for years, that can feel unsettling, sometimes even humiliating. Not because she judges him, because she sees the gap between who he says he is and who he actually is. And eventually, he sees it too. There are moments where this realization becomes almost impossible to ignore. Usually they're quiet moments, not dramatic ones. A random evening, a random conversation, a random silence. He notices that she understands his moods before he explains them. She notices when something feels off. She remembers details he forgot he shared. She hears things underneath the words. And suddenly he realizes she's paying attention in ways most people don't. That realization creates two completely opposite reactions. One voice says, "Stay. This is rare." The other voice says, "Be careful. This is dangerous." Both voices sound convincing. That's why deep intimacy creates so much contradiction. Because being seen fulfills a need, but it also exposes one. And exposed needs are uncomfortable, especially for men who learn to survive by minimizing them. Sometimes the internal dialogue sounds ridiculous. Why does this bother me so much? Because she noticed. So what? Because nobody notices. That's a good thing, is it? The conversation never fully ends. It just keeps evolving, quietly, underneath everything. And maybe that's the truth people miss. Deep intimacy and frightening because someone knows your secrets. Most secrets aren't that interesting. What's frightening is when someone sees the things you haven't fully admitted to yourself yet. The loneliness beneath the independence. The fear beneath the confidence. The exhaustion beneath the competence. The tenderness beneath the control. And suddenly you're standing there feeling two completely opposite things at once. Relief and panic. Gratitude and resistance. The desire to move closer and the urge to run. Because now it's no longer about whether she likes him. It's no longer about attraction or chemistry or potential. Now something much more unsettling is happening. Someone has started seeing the man underneath the version he's spent years presenting to the world. And whether he's ready for that or not, something inside him already knows she isn't entirely wrong. Which is exactly why he can't stop thinking about it. This is the part that confuses almost everyone, including him. Maybe especially him. Because people assume that once intimacy finally happens, things become easier, clearer, safer. You get close to someone. You feel connected. You feel understood. and naturally you move even closer. That's the version people expect. Sometimes it happens that way, but sometimes something far stranger happens. The closer he feels, the more unsettled he becomes. And from the outside, it can look completely irrational. 1 week he's present, warm, open, engaged. Then suddenly he's harder to reach. Replies become shorter. Energy shifts. Something feels different. And everyone starts asking the same question. What happened? The uncomfortable answer is, sometimes nothing happened. At least nothing visible. The closeness happened. That's what happened. And nobody talks about how overwhelming closeness can feel when you're not used to it. I remember realizing this years ago. Not during an argument. Not during a breakup. Not during some dramatic emotional moment. It happened after one of the best nights we'd had together, which somehow made it worse. We had talked for hours. The conversation flowed effortlessly. No performances. No pretending. No carefully controlled version of myself. Just honesty. The easy kind. The kind that sneaks up on you. One story becomes another. One laugh becomes another. Hours disappear. At some point, I remember looking at the clock and feeling surprised. Not because it was late, because I hadn't wanted to leave. And that's when I should have known trouble was coming. Not relationship trouble, internal trouble. Because on the drive home something strange started happening. I felt restless, agitated, almost anxious, which made absolutely no sense. The evening had been wonderful. So why did my chest feel tight? Why did my thoughts suddenly speed up? Why did I feel the urge to pull back? Nothing bad had happened. That's what made it confusing. I think people assume fear only appears when something hurts. But fear can appear when something matters. And that's a very different experience. The realization isn't, this feels wrong. The realization is, this feels important. And importance changes everything. Because now there is something to lose. That's when the mind starts doing what minds do. Creating problems that don't exist yet. Projecting outcomes. Imagining future pain. Looking for exits before or any danger appears. It's almost embarrassing how quickly it can happen. One moment he's feeling connected. The next he's mentally reviewing every possible reason this won't work. Not because he wants to. Because vulnerability creates uncertainty. And uncertainty can feel threatening. Especially to people who are used to staying emotionally self-contained. I remember getting home that night and doing something ridiculous. I cleaned my apartment. At midnight. Nobody was coming over. Nothing needed cleaning. But suddenly I was organizing shelves, folding clothes, wiping down counters. Anything except sitting still with what I was feeling. At the time, I thought I was being productive. Looking back, I was overwhelmed. Not devastated. Not heartbroken. Overwhelmed. There's a difference. And I think a lot of men don't recognize emotional overwhelm when it happens. Because it rarely looks emotional. Sometimes it looks like busyness. Sometimes it looks like distraction. Sometimes it looks like becoming obsessed with work for 3 days. Sometimes it looks like suddenly needing space you didn't need a week ago. The body starts searching for regulation before the mind understands what's happening. That's why some of the strangest behavior shows up immediately after meaningful connection. Not before. After. A lot of women have experienced this and felt completely confused by it. He finally opens up, shares something vulnerable, lets her closer. Everything feels genuine. Then he disappears emotionally for a while. Not completely, just enough to create confusion. enough to make her wonder if she imagined the connection, enough to make her question what happened. And honestly, sometimes he's wondering the same thing, because the truth is, he doesn't always understand his own reaction. I've had moments where I genuinely wanted closeness, then received it, then felt an immediate urge to retreat. Not because I stopped caring, because caring became real, and real things activate fears that imaginary things never touch. Fantasy is easy. Potential is easy. Distance is easy. Actual intimacy is harder, because intimacy removes certain illusions. Now there's a real person, real feelings, real emotional consequences, and suddenly the stakes feel different. I remember staring at my phone one morning after a particularly meaningful conversation the night before. Her message was sitting there. Nothing dramatic, just a simple check-in. And for reasons I couldn't explain, I didn't respond right away. Not because I didn't want to, because I wanted to too much. That sounds ridiculous. I know, but it's true. The more emotionally significant something becomes, the more self-conscious some people get. Every interaction suddenly feels heavier. Every response feels more meaningful. And instead of moving naturally, they start overthinking. I think this is where a lot of misunderstandings begin. Because externally it looks like disinterest. Internally it can be the exact opposite. Not always. Sometimes distance is distance. But sometimes distance is emotional flooding disguised as detachment. And emotional flooding doesn't look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like a man sitting in his car for 40 minutes listening to the same song. Not because he's sad, because he can't quite settle. Something inside him feels activated, unresolved, too alive, and he doesn't know what to do with it. There's a particular silence that shows up after intimacy. I've noticed it in myself. I've noticed it in other men. It's different from ordinary silence. Ordinary silence feels neutral. This silence feels crowded, full of thoughts, questions, memories, possibilities, fear, hope, all occupying the same space. And because it feels crowded, he often withdraws, not from her necessarily, from stimulation, from emotional input, from anything that requires more feeling, because he hasn't fully processed the feelings already there. I remember a conversation with a friend years ago. He had just met someone who genuinely mattered to him, more than he wanted to admit, more than he expected. And after spending an incredible weekend with her, he became distant. I asked him why. His answer stayed with me. He said, "I don't know." Then he left. Then he looked down at his coffee. Then he said, "I think I'm trying to catch up." That was probably the most honest answer possible. Trying to catch up. Because sometimes the emotional experience happens faster than the emotional understanding. His heart arrives before his explanations do. His feelings arrive before his certainty does. And in that gap, strange behavior appears. Contradictory behavior. Human behavior. One part of him wants connection. Another part starts protecting itself from the possibility of losing that connection. Both are operating simultaneously, which creates confusion. Not just for her, for him. Internal dialogue starts sounding ridiculous. You miss her. I know. Then call her. Not yet. Why not? I don't know. That's not an answer. I know. The conversation loops endlessly. Logic becomes strangely ineffective. Because this isn't really about logic. It's about emotional exposure. And emotional exposure can make intelligent people behave in surprisingly irrational ways. especially men who have spent years measuring themselves by self-control. Because intimacy introduces variables you can't control. How much you care, how much you miss someone, how much influence they suddenly have over your emotional state. Those realizations can feel deeply uncomfortable, not because they're unhealthy, because they're humbling. Nobody likes discovering they're more vulnerable than they thought, especially after convincing themselves they weren't. Sometimes he becomes quieter after intimacy. Sometimes he becomes more serious. Sometimes he starts analyzing everything. Sometimes he becomes colder, not intentionally, almost defensively, as if creating distance might restore balance. But here's the strange part. The distance rarely brings relief. That's what nobody tells you. The space he thinks he needs often becomes its own problem. Because now she's gone, and the silence starts filling with her absence. The same mind that wanted distance starts replaying conversations, remembering details, missing things, wondering things, creating entire conversations that never happen. And suddenly the thing he thought would calm him down starts making him restless. I've seen that happen too many times to ignore it. He says he needs space, then spends the entire week thinking about her. He becomes less available, then checks his phone every 10 minutes. He pulls away physically, then feels her absence everywhere. In the car, in random songs, in ordinary moments, in places she isn't. That's the contradiction nobody prepares him for. The closeness scares him, but the distance doesn't save him. And somewhere in the middle of all that confusion, he slowly begins realizing something. The panic wasn't actually about her. Not entirely. The panic came from what the closeness revealed. How much he cared. How much he needed. How much he could lose. How much of himself was suddenly involved. And that's a difficult thing to face, especially for someone who spent years believing he could stay untouched, and touched by need, and touched by vulnerability, and touched by love. Then one ordinary human connection quietly proves otherwise. And for a while, that realization can feel more overwhelming than the intimacy itself. One of the strangest things deep intimacy unlocks isn't love. It isn't commitment. It isn't even vulnerability. It's memory. Not the kind of memory people talk about. Not anniversaries. Not important dates. Not major life events. I mean the weird memories. The ones he hasn't thought about in years. The moments he forgot existed. The emotional fragments buried somewhere deep in the back of his mind. Because something happens when another person gets close enough. Not physically, emotionally. They start opening doors inside him that he didn't know were still there. And the frustrating part is, it usually happens without permission. One day he's thinking about her. The next day he's thinking about himself at 16. And he has absolutely no idea how he got there. I've experienced this. I've watched other men experience it. It's almost unsettling. You think you're dealing with one relationship. Then suddenly old memories start showing up like uninvited guests. A song, a smell, a sentence, a facial expression. And somehow you're standing in your kitchen remembering something from 15 years ago. Not because you wanted to, because something inside you made a connection. I remember driving home late one night. The road was mostly empty, just headlights passing occasionally. Nothing unusual, nothing emotional. Then a song came on, a completely ordinary song. One I had heard dozens of times before, but this time it hit differently. Not because of the lyrics, because she had mentioned liking it a few weeks earlier, and suddenly my brain did something strange. The song reminded me of her, Then somehow it reminded me of a girl I knew years ago. Then somehow it reminded me of being 19. Then somehow it reminded me of sitting alone in a parking lot after my first real heartbreak. Within 30 seconds, I had traveled through 15 years of memories. And all because of one stupid song. That's the thing nobody warns you about. Intimacy creates emotional associations. And emotional associations wake things up. Not just the good things. Everything. The mind starts pulling files from storage. Old disappointments. Old hopes. Old wounds. Old versions of yourself. And most of the time, he doesn't understand why. He just knows something feels different. Something feels active. Like parts of him that have been asleep for years suddenly started moving around again. I think men often mistake this for confusion, but it's actually recognition. Something inside him recognizes the emotional significance before he consciously does. That's why certain memories appear, not randomly, connected. There's usually a thread, a hidden thread. Maybe she makes him feel safe. Suddenly he's remembering a time he didn't feel safe. Maybe she listens carefully. Suddenly he's remembering years of feeling misunderstood. Maybe she stays emotionally present. Suddenly he's remembering everyone who didn't. The present starts pulling on the past. And before he realizes what's happening, he's carrying far more emotional material than he expected. I remember one conversation that stayed with me. Not because it was profound, because it activated something. She asked a simple question, the kind of question most people wouldn't think twice about. What were you like as a kid? That was it. Nothing complicated, nothing therapeutic. But for some reason I froze. Not visibly, internally. Because I hadn't thought about that version of myself in years. Not really. Most adults don't. We think about jobs, responsibilities, bills, schedules, deadlines. We don't spend much time thinking about who we were before all that. But after she asked, I couldn't stop thinking about it. For days, memories started surfacing. The house I grew up in, the smell of old books, the sound of the television late at night, the way I used to sit alone in my room imagining what adulthood would feel like. Tiny details, meaningless details, except suddenly they didn't feel meaningless, because they connected to something, to who I became, to who I pretended to be, to who I still was underneath everything. Deep intimacy has a strange way of collapsing time. That's probably the best way I can describe it. The man sitting in his apartment at 35 suddenly meets the boy he was at 12. Not literally, emotionally. And sometimes those two versions don't know what to do with each other. I've seen men become emotional over things that make absolutely no sense on the surface. A childhood memory, an old photograph, a random street, a familiar smell. Not because they're sentimental, because intimacy made them more emotionally accessible. The walls aren't working as efficiently anymore. And once those walls start softening, other things come through too. Things he thought he had already dealt with. That's another uncomfortable truth. A lot of men believe they've moved on from things simply because they stopped talking about them. But silence isn't always resolution. Sometimes it's storage, temporary storage. And intimacy has a habit of opening storage rooms. I remember realizing this one night while scrolling through old photos. I wasn't looking for anything. At least, I don't think I was. But somehow I ended up 10 years back, looking at versions of myself I barely recognized. Different apartment, different friends, different haircut, different dreams. And suddenly I felt this strange sadness. Not devastating sadness, just something quiet. A realization. How many versions of yourself disappear over time? How many people you become? How many people you stop being? And strangely, thinking about her had led me there. Because when someone starts mattering deeply, they don't just make you think about the future. They make you reevaluate the past. You start noticing patterns, connections, contradictions. You start asking questions. Questions you avoided before. Why did that relationship affect me so much? Why did that rejection stay with me? Why did I become so independent? Why is receiving care still uncomfortable? Questions like that. The annoying questions. The ones without immediate answers. I think that's why some men become quieter during periods of deep emotional connection. People assume they're losing interest. Sometimes they're processing, not the relationship, themselves. They're trying to understand why certain reactions feel so familiar, why certain fears keep appearing, why certain moments hit harder than expected. And sometimes the answers aren't in the present. Sometimes they're buried years back. There was a moment I remember vividly. I was sitting alone after a conversation with her. Nothing dramatic had happened. Actually, it had been a really good conversation, which somehow made what happened next stranger. I suddenly remembered a moment from childhood. A tiny moment. A completely insignificant moment. Or at least I thought it was. I remembered being upset about something. I don't even remember what. And I remember deciding not to tell anyone. Just handling it myself. Just swallowing it. Moving on. Being fine. I hadn't thought about that memory in decades. Decades. Yet there it was. Clear as day. And what struck me wasn't the memory itself. It was the realization. I never stopped doing that. I was still doing it. The adult version just looked more sophisticated. That's what intimacy sometimes reveals. Not through lessons. Not through advice. Through recognition. You suddenly see yourself. Maybe for the first time in years. And it's rarely comfortable. Because the truth is often embarrassingly ordinary. Not some grand emotional wound. Just habits. Defense mechanisms. Patterns. Ways of surviving that eventually became ways of living. And once he sees them, he can't entirely unsee them. Sometimes he wishes he could. Because awareness creates responsibility. The old explanations stop working. The old stories stop working. The old excuses start sounding weaker. And now, he's left sitting with truths he wasn't planning to confront. The funny thing is, she may not even know she's doing any of this. She may think they're simply talking, spending time together, building a connection. Meanwhile, entire sections of his emotional history are waking up. Old memories, old fears, old tenderness, old grief, old versions of himself, all quietly resurfacing. Not because she forced them to, because intimacy has a way of making hidden things visible. And for a man who has spent years staying busy enough to avoid looking backward, that can feel overwhelming. Not tragic, not catastrophic, just deeply human. Because eventually he realizes something. The connection isn't only teaching him about her, it's teaching him about himself, about who he was, who he became, what he lost, what he protected, what he still carries. And sometimes the realization arrives in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday night. Driving home, listening to music, thinking about a woman, then suddenly finding himself face to face with memories he thought had disappeared forever, only to realize they were never gone. They were just waiting for something meaningful enough to bring them back. This is probably the chapter that frustrates people the most. Because from the outside, it looks ridiculous. If he cares, why pull away? If he misses her, why become distant? If the connection is meaningful, why create space? It's a fair question. Honestly, it's the same question I've asked myself more than once. Because when you're the one doing it, it doesn't always make sense either. That's the uncomfortable part nobody likes admitting. Sometimes he knows exactly what he's doing, and sometimes he genuinely doesn't. Sometimes he's standing in the middle of his own contradiction, wondering why he's making choices that don't match his feelings. And somehow he keeps making them anyway. I remember a period in my life when I cared deeply about someone. Not theoretically, not potentially, actually cared. The kind of caring that quietly enters your daily routines. The kind where her absence changes the shape of your day. Where random things remind you of her. Where your first instinct is to tell her something before remembering she's not beside you. And yet, during that same period, I became harder to reach. Not easier, harder. Which sounds insane when I say it out loud. Because it was. Part of me wanted more connection. Another part was already backing away. Not dramatically, just enough. Taking longer to reply. Being less emotionally available. Keeping certain thoughts to myself. Acting like everything was normal when internally wasn't. At the time, I kept telling myself I was just busy. And maybe part of that was true. Life was busy. Work was demanding. Responsibilities were real. But if I'm being honest, that wasn't the whole story. Not even close. The deeper truth was harder to admit. The closer I felt to her, the more exposed I felt. And exposure does strange things to people, especially people who are used to feeling emotionally self-sufficient. I think that's something many men struggle to articulate. For years, he builds an identity around handling things alone. Not because he wants to be lonely, because independence feels safe, predictable, manageable. Then someone arrives who makes him want things he's stopped needing from anyone else. Comfort, support, understanding, presence. Suddenly, he has emotional needs again. And that realization can feel surprisingly uncomfortable. Not because the needs are wrong, because needing anything creates vulnerability. I remember one evening sitting on my couch or talking to her for hours. The conversation had been easy, natural, the kind of conversation that makes time disappear. When it ended, I felt good, really good. Then, maybe 20 minutes later, I felt anxious. Not because of anything he said, not because something went wrong, because I realized how much that conversation had mattered to me. And for some reason, that realization made me uneasy. I kept pacing around my apartment, checking my phone, putting it down, picking it back up, opening messages, closing messages, not doing anything productive, just restless. Eventually, I asked myself, what exactly is your problem? And the answer that surfaced wasn't flattering. I cared. That was the problem. Or at least that's what it felt like. Because caring introduces risk. Now her mood affects him. Now her absence affects him. Now her presence affects him. And suddenly he's no longer operating from emotional neutrality. He's invested. And investment can feel terrifying if you're not used to it. Especially when previous investments haven't gone well. That's another layer people often miss. When a man pulls away, it isn't always about the current connection. Sometimes he's reacting to old experiences that have nothing to do with her. Old disappointments, old losses, old moments where caring deeply ended badly. The present gets mixed with the past. And before he realizes what's happening, he's protecting himself from something that isn't even occurring. I've watched men do this. I've done it myself. Someone starts becoming important. Instead of moving closer, they start mentally preparing for loss. Not consciously, subconsciously, as if expecting disappointment will somehow soften it if it comes, which never works, by the way. But people do it anyway. Humans are strange like that. I remember a conversation with a friend years ago. He was talking about a woman he genuinely loved. You could hear it in his voice, see it in his face, feel it in the way he spoke about her. Yet he kept creating distance. Eventually, I asked him why. His answer was immediate. Too immediate. Almost rehearsed. I don't want to get hurt. Then he laughed. The kind of laugh people use when they accidentally tell the truth. And suddenly everything made sense. Because that's often what's underneath the withdrawal. Not lack of feeling. Too much feeling. Not indifference. Fear. Not certainty. Uncertainty. And uncertainty is difficult for people who like control. The problem is, relationships don't offer much control. That's part of what makes them meaningful, and part of what makes them frightening. You can control your schedule, your work, your routine, your goals, but you can't fully control another person's heart. You can't guarantee outcomes. You can't guarantee permanence. You can't guarantee safety. And for someone who finds comfort in certainty, that's a difficult reality. So he starts creating distance. Not necessarily because he wants distance, because distance feels like control, at least temporarily. The strange thing is how ordinary this behavior can look. People imagine emotional avoidance as something dramatic. It's usually much smaller, much quieter, much more human. Maybe he stops sharing certain thoughts. Maybe he responds with fewer details. Maybe he becomes more focused on work. Maybe he suddenly seems distracted. Maybe he says he's tired more often. Maybe he genuinely is tired. But not only physically, emotionally. Because emotional closeness requires energy. Not bad energy. Just energy. Attention. Presence. Self-awareness. And when someone isn't accustomed to operating that way consistently, it can feel overwhelming. I remember a specific moment. She asked me a simple question. What are you thinking about? I wasn't prepared for how difficult that question felt. Not because I was hiding anything terrible. Because the honest answer was vulnerable. The honest answer was, this. How much this matters. How much it scares me. Instead, I shrugged and said, nothing. Nothing. The oldest lie in the world. And she knew it. I knew she knew it. She knew I knew she knew it. And somehow we both let it pass. Looking back, I think that moment explains a lot. Sometimes men pull away because they don't know how to express what's actually happening inside them. Not elegantly, not clearly. Sometimes they barely understand it themselves. So instead of communicating confusion, they communicate distance, which creates even more confusion. It's an unfortunate system, but it's common. The internal dialogue often sounds ridiculous. You should call her. Later. You miss her. I know. Then why are you acting like this? I don't know. That's becoming a pattern. I know. The conversation loops endlessly. Logic rarely wins. Because fear isn't logical. Fear is protective. Protective even when protection isn't necessary. Protective even when protection creates the very outcome you're afraid of. That's the tragic irony. Sometimes the distance meant to prevent pain creates pain. Sometimes the withdrawal meant to create safety creates loneliness. Sometimes the space meant to provide clarity creates confusion. And eventually, he starts feeling the consequences. That's when things get interesting. Because distance initially feels relieving. For a moment, a brief moment, then something else arrives. The silence, the absence, the awareness. Now she's not there. Now the conversations are gone. Now the connection feels farther away. And suddenly the thing he thought he needed starts hurting. I've experienced that too. You create space, then spend the entire day thinking about the person you're supposedly creating space from. You become less available, then check your phone constantly. You withdraw, then miss them. The contradiction becomes impossible to ignore because the truth slowly emerges. The distance wasn't solving the problem. The distance was the problem, or at least part of it. Eventually, a realization starts forming. Slowly, painfully, often later than it should. The realization that his withdrawal was never really about her. Not entirely. It was about what she awakened inside him. Need, hope, attachment, dependence, tenderness, fear, the uncomfortable reality that another human being suddenly mattered. And that matters more than most men are prepared to admit, especially to themselves. Because beneath all the explanations, I need space. I'm busy. I have a lot going on. I need time to think. There is sometimes a quieter truth, a truth he may not fully understand until much later. The closer she got, the harder it became to pretend he had nothing to lose. And for a man who spent years convincing himself he didn't need much from anyone, that realization can feel far more frightening than being alone ever did. I don't think people talk enough about grief that happens before or anything is officially lost. Because that's the strange thing about deep intimacy. Sometimes the grief starts long before the ending. Sometimes it begins the moment he realizes he can't go back to who he was before. And that realization is far more emotional than most men are willing to admit, especially to themselves. People tend to think grief belongs to breakups, divorces, deaths, goodbyes, obvious endings. But there is another kind, a quieter kind, a private kind. The grief of realizing something important has changed inside you. And no matter what happens next, you can't undo it. I've seen men experience this. I've experienced it myself. It doesn't usually arrive dramatically. It sneaks in. An ordinary afternoon, a random drive, a moment at work, a song playing in a grocery store. Suddenly something feels different. Not wrong, just different. And for a second he realizes, I can't pretend this doesn't matter anymore. That's when the grief begins. Because pretending was easier. Distance was easier. Emotional numbness was easier. Not happier, just simpler. There is a version of many men that exists before deep intimacy. A version that moves through life relatively untouched. Busy, distracted, focused, functioning, maybe a little lonely, maybe a little disconnected, but comfortable enough. Comfortable in the way people become comfortable carrying something they've held for years. Then someone enters his life, and slowly, almost accidentally, she starts waking up parts of him. Not through magic, not through perfection, not because she's flawless, usually because she's present, because she listens, because she notices things, because she stays in moments most people rush past. And after enough of those moments, something changes. The problem is that once something changes, it becomes difficult to return to ignorance. He can pull away. He can create distance. He can stop talking. He can disappear for a while. But he can't unknow what he knows. And that's where the grief lives. Not in losing her, in losing the version of himself that could remain emotionally asleep. I remember a night when this realization hit me harder than expected. Nothing dramatic had happened. Actually, that's becoming a theme. Most important realizations arrive during completely ordinary moments. I was sitting on my couch, television on, not really watching it, phone in my hand, scrolling aimlessly, the kind of scrolling people do when they're avoiding their own thoughts. And before I even realized what I was doing, I opened her profile. Not because I had a reason, not because I planned to. My thumb just moved there automatically. I looked, read a few things, saw a photo, then closed it. Didn't like anything, didn't comment, didn't send a message, nothing. Just looked, then put my phone down and felt something I couldn't immediately name. Part relief, part sadness, part longing, part acceptance. Everything mixed together. The truth is, I wasn't looking for information. I missed her. That's what was happening. But somehow admitting that felt larger than opening the profile itself. Because missing someone forces you to acknowledge their impact. And sometimes men resist that acknowledgement for a very long time. There is an odd pride that can develop around emotional self-sufficiency. Not healthy pride. Protective pride. The belief that you should be fine. That you should move on. That you should need less. That you should recover faster. That you shouldn't still think about them. And when reality refuses to cooperate with those expectations, something painful happens. Not dramatic pain. Humbling pain. The kind that quietly dismantles your self-image. I remember having an internal conversation one night. The kind nobody hears. The kind that sounds ridiculous when spoken aloud. You miss her. No, I don't. You just checked her profile 3 times. That doesn't mean anything. Okay, it means something. Yeah, that was the entire conversation. No wisdom. No breakthrough. Just reluctant honesty. And honestly, a lot of emotional growth looks exactly like that. Not grand revelations. Tiny moments where denial becomes slightly harder to maintain. The grief becomes more noticeable because it often exists alongside gratitude. That's what makes it confusing. If it were pure sadness, it would be easier. But it isn't. He misses her. And he's grateful he met her. He feels loss and appreciation, relief and longing at the same time. Human emotions are rarely organized, especially after meaningful connection. I think people underestimate how much men mourn internally, not because they're incapable of expressing emotions, because they often don't know where to put them. There are few spaces where men are encouraged to openly process emotional attachment. So they carry it privately, during commutes, late at night, at the gym, in grocery stores, while answering emails, while pretending everything is normal. Meanwhile, an entire emotional conversation is happening underneath. One of the hardest parts is realizing how often she appears in ordinary life. Not constantly, just enough to catch him off guard. He hears someone laugh similarly. His chest tightens for half a second. A song appears unexpectedly. A memory follows. A restaurant, a street, a phrase, something small, and suddenly she's present again. Not physically, emotionally, for a moment, then gone. The strange thing is how quickly these moments arrive, and how quickly they disappear, like emotional weather, passing through, leaving traces behind. I remember hearing someone use a phrase she always used, a completely ordinary phrase. most people wouldn't have noticed. I noticed immediately. For a split second, I looked up, as if part of me expected her to be standing there. She wasn't. Of course she wasn't. But the reaction happened before logic had a chance to intervene. The body remembered. That's another uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the body remembers before the mind catches up. You think you're fine. Then suddenly a memory lands somewhere beneath your awareness. And your mood shifts. Your breathing changes. Your attention drifts. Something feels heavier. Not devastatingly, just noticeably. People often ask why some men become emotionally distant after intimacy. Part of the answer lives here. Because deep intimacy creates emotional residue. The connection doesn't simply disappear when the interaction ends. It lingers. In habits, in thoughts, in expectations, in routines. And eventually, he realizes something. The emotional distance he created didn't remove the attachment. It just made it quieter. The feelings moved underground. That's all. And eventually, they find their way back up. Usually when he least expects it. I think one of the saddest realizations arrives when he understands he isn't grieving the relationship alone. He's grieving a possibility. A future that never fully happened. Conversations that never occurred. Experiences never shared. Versions of himself that only existed in potential. Potential has a strange emotional weight. Sometimes heavier than reality. Because reality has limits. Potential has imagination. And imagination can be relentless. There are moments where he wonders what would have happened if he had been more honest. More available. Less afraid. More direct. The mind loves these questions. Not because they have answers. Because they don't. The questions remain open. And finished. And unfinished things tend to echo. Especially late at night. Especially when life gets quiet. Especially when he's finally alone with himself. I remember sitting in my car after work one evening. The engine off. The parking lot almost empty. And for no obvious reason, I found myself thinking about a conversation from months earlier. One sentence. Just one. Something she had said casually. Something I barely reacted to at the time. Yet suddenly it carried new meaning. And I realized something painful. I understood her better now than I did when she was actually there. That realization stayed with me. Because sometimes understanding arrives late. Sometimes clarity arrives after distance. Sometimes emotional truth becomes visible only after the noise settles. And that's part of the grief too. The awareness that some realizations come after the moment they were needed. Not because he wasn't intelligent enough. Because he wasn't ready enough. There's a difference. Maybe that's what deep intimacy ultimately leaves behind. Not certainty. Not perfect understanding. Not even closure. Sometimes it leaves a private ache. A quiet awareness. The realization that someone changed the emotional landscape of his life. And whether they stayed or left. Whether they talked every day or never spoke again. Whether the story continued or didn't. He can never fully return to the version of himself that existed before. Part of him misses her. Part of him misses who he was with her. Part of him misses the possibilities. And part of him is grateful for all of it. Which is why the grief remains so difficult to explain. Because it isn't only sadness. It's love, loss, recognition, growth, regret, appreciation, and memory, all sitting together in the same quiet room, long after everyone else thinks he's moved on. I think one of the most uncomfortable things intimacy does is expose the gap between who he thinks he is and who he actually becomes when someone truly matters. Most men have a story about themselves. Not necessarily a lie, just a story, a version, and an identity. I'm independent. I'm logical. I'm easygoing. I don't get attached. I don't need much. I handle things. I move on. Maybe some of those things are true. Maybe all of them are partially true. But intimacy has a strange habit of testing every sentence you've ever used to describe yourself. And sometimes the results are humbling, because eventually someone comes along who makes you act differently than the man you've spent years believing you are. Not dramatically, subtly, and somehow that's worse. I remember believing I was very emotionally controlled. That was one of my favorite stories about myself. Calm, reasonable, measured, the guy who didn't overreact, the guy who kept perspective, the guy who wasn't ruled by emotions. Then I met someone who mattered, and suddenly I found myself staring at my phone wondering why she hadn't responded. Not obsessively, just enough to irritate me, enough to challenge the story, because the story said I didn't care about things like that. Reality suggested otherwise. And that's where the discomfort begins. Not when intimacy reveals your weaknesses, when it reveals your contradictions. Weaknesses are easier. Contradictions force you to question your identity. I think a lot of men spend years constructing versions of themselves around what feels safe. Not consciously, gradually. Life teaches lessons. Heartbreak teaches lessons. Disappointment teaches lessons. And eventually a man develops a certain image. Sometimes that image protects him. Sometimes it limits him. Usually both. Then intimacy arrives and starts testing every piece of it. I remember one evening sitting alone after an argument. Not a major argument. Nothing explosive. Just one of those uncomfortable conversations where someone points out something true. The worst kind. Because if they're wrong, it's easier. You defend yourself. You explain. You move on. But when they're right, there's nowhere to go. She had said something simple. You always leave emotionally before you leave physically. I remember immediately wanting to argue, to explain, to justify, to defend, the usual things. Instead, I got quiet, because somewhere underneath the defensiveness, I knew what she meant, and that realization bothered me far more than the argument itself. I think that's what intimacy often exposes. Not the things he doesn't know, the things he already knows but prefers not to examine. That's a very different experience. The truth is, most people aren't completely unaware of their patterns. They just stay busy enough to avoid looking directly at them. Then someone comes close enough to hold up a mirror, and suddenly avoidance becomes harder. There are moments where he starts noticing himself in real time. That's a strange experience. Watching yourself do something while simultaneously understanding why you're doing it. Like becoming distant after feeling vulnerable. Like shutting down during emotional conversations. Like pretending not to care when you care deeply. Part of him is performing the behavior. Another part is observing it. Almost embarrassed. Almost frustrated. Almost amused. I've had moments like that. Moments where I knew exactly what I was doing, and kept doing it anyway. She would ask something honest. I would give a partial answer. Not a lie. Just not the full truth. Then later I'd sit alone replaying the conversation, thinking, why didn't you just say what you meant? And the answer was never flattering. Because honesty felt exposed. Because vulnerability felt risky. Because I wanted connection while simultaneously protecting myself from it. Human beings are complicated. Men are not exceptions. Sometimes they're simply less practiced at talking about the complexity. One thing I've noticed is that intimacy exposes immaturity in ways success never can. Success can hide a lot. A man can be intelligent, accomplished, respected, disciplined, competent. Then one meaningful relationship comes along and suddenly he's acting like someone who has no idea what he's doing. Checking messages, overthinking conversations, getting defensive, avoiding discussions, misinterpreting things, creating unnecessary distance, acting younger emotionally than he does everywhere else in life. And honestly, that's difficult to admit, especially for men who take pride in competence, because competence creates confidence. Relationships expose where competence ends. There is something deeply humbling about discovering that being successful at life doesn't automatically make you good at intimacy. I remember a conversation with a friend who had built an impressive life. Career, finances, respect, everything looked solid. Then he met someone he genuinely cared about, and suddenly he was confused all the time. One day he looked at me and said, "I feel like an idiot." I laughed. He laughed too. Then he said, "No, seriously." And I knew exactly what he meant. Because intimacy exposes parts of us that don't care about our resumes. The emotional self operates by different rules. It doesn't care how accomplished you are. It cares whether you're honest, whether you're available, whether you're present. And those things can be surprisingly difficult, especially when you've spent years perfecting everything else. Sometimes intimacy reveals pride, not the obvious kind, the subtle kind, the kind that says, "I shouldn't need reassurance. I shouldn't be affected by this. I shouldn't care this much. I shouldn't miss her. I shouldn't feel hurt. I shouldn't feel vulnerable." The word "shouldn't" becomes very active. And eventually he realizes something. The problem isn't the feeling. The problem is his relationship with the feeling. Because feelings rarely ask permission. They simply arrive. The resistance comes afterward. That's another mirror intimacy holds up. The difference between emotional experience and emotional acceptance. I've seen men accept anger faster than sadness, accept frustration faster than longing, accept distance faster than tenderness. Not because those emotions are stronger, because they feel safer. Tenderness requires openness. Longing requires acknowledgement. Missing someone requires honesty. And honesty can be difficult when it conflicts with the identity you've built. I remember one particular night. I couldn't sleep. Nothing dramatic had happened. No breakup. No crisis. Just a restless mind. The kind that replays conversations when the room gets quiet. Round 2 in the morning, I found myself rereading old messages. Not because I needed information, because I missed how I felt during those conversations. And suddenly a realization hit me, one I didn't particularly enjoy. The version of myself I admired most wasn't the self-sufficient version. It was the emotionally open version. The version that laughed more, shared more, felt more. The version I kept trying to protect myself from becoming. That realization stayed with me because it exposed another contradiction. Sometimes we defend ourselves against the very experiences we actually want. Not intentionally, habitually. The protective mechanisms become so familiar that they continue operating even when protection is no longer necessary. That's where self-awareness becomes uncomfortable, because eventually he sees the pattern. Not perfectly, not all at once, just enough. Enough to notice, enough to recognize, enough to stop blaming circumstances for everything. And that's not always a pleasant process. There are moments where accountability feels heavier than heartbreak, because heartbreak can be assigned externally. Accountability points inward, toward choices, toward behaviors, toward opportunities missed, toward truths avoided, toward fears disguised as logic. Those realizations arrive quietly, usually alone, usually long after the conversation ends, long after the relationship changes, long after the emotional dust settles. And when they arrive, they often sound less profound than people imagine. More like this: you knew. Maybe not everything, but enough. You knew you cared. You knew you were afraid. You knew you were pulling away. You knew why, at least partially. And that's where intimacy becomes impossible to ignore, because it stops being about her. For a moment, it stops being about the relationship entirely. Now it's about the man staring back from the mirror, the man behind the explanations, the man behind the image, the man behind the stories, the man who says he's independent but wants connection, the man who says he doesn't need much but misses deeply, the man who says he's fine while replaying conversations months later, the man who wants closeness and fears it, the man who wants honesty and avoids it, the man who wants love but struggles to receive it, not because he's broken, because he's human. And perhaps that's the most uncomfortable thing intimacy exposes. Not weakness, not failure, not damage. Humanity. Messy, contradictory, beautiful, immature, tender, defensive, hopeful, afraid, all at the same time. And once he sees that version of himself clearly, the old story becomes much harder to believe, because now he knows something he didn't know before, or maybe something he always knew. The man he pretended to be was never the whole truth, and the man underneath him is far more complicated than he ever wanted to admit. I think this is where a lot of people get this story wrong, because when people talk about profound connection, they often describe the outcome as if it's something beautiful and immediate, as if intimacy unlocks clarity, confidence, certainty, wisdom, as if a man suddenly becomes emotionally fluent overnight, as if he finally understands himself, finally understands love, finally understands what matters. And maybe that happens for some people, but honestly, that's not what I've seen. What I've seen is much messier, much less impressive, much more human. Deep intimacy doesn't automatically make a man wiser. Sometimes it just makes him aware. And awareness is not always pleasant. In fact, awareness can be exhausting. Because once you become aware of something, you lose the ability to comfortably ignore it. That's what intimacy actually unlocked for me. Not answers. Awareness. The awareness of how often I avoided things. The awareness of how much I wanted connection. The awareness of how uncomfortable I was receiving it. The awareness of how often I confused self-protection with strength. None of those realizations felt inspiring. Most of them felt annoying. I remember a period where I started noticing my own behavior in ways I hadn't before. Not changing it immediately, just noticing it. Which sounds like a small thing. It's not. Noticing is where everything starts. And noticing can be incredibly frustrating. Because before awareness, you have excuses. After awareness, you have choices. And choices are harder to hide from. I remember sitting in my car after a conversation with her. The discussion itself wasn't significant, at least not externally. But afterward, I noticed something. I kept replaying one particular moment. Not because of what she said, because of what I did. She had asked something vulnerable, and I had responded with humor. Again, The same thing I always did. The same deflection. The same sidestep. The same escape route disguised as personality. For years, I thought that was just who I was. Funny, easygoing, lighthearted. Then suddenly I realized something uncomfortable. Sometimes I wasn't being funny. Sometimes I was hiding. That realization stayed with me. Not because it was profound, because it was accurate. And accuracy has a way of lingering. That's one of the things intimacy unlocks. Self-observation. The ability to watch yourself honestly. Not cruelly. Not judgmentally. Just honestly. And honesty can feel surprisingly vulnerable, especially when it reveals things you'd rather not see. I think a lot of men believe growth feels powerful. Sometimes it feels embarrassing. Sometimes growth looks like realizing you've been repeating the same emotional behavior for 10 years. Sometimes growth looks like noticing how quickly you withdraw when someone gets too close. Sometimes growth looks like rereading old conversations and realizing she was trying to understand you while you were busy protecting yourself from being understood. Those aren't glamorous moments. Nobody posts those moments online. Nobody celebrates them. But they're real. And they're often where actual change begins. I remember another realization that arrived unexpectedly. I was at the grocery store. A completely ordinary Tuesday. Nothing emotional. Nothing symbolic. Just buying food. Then I walked past something she used to buy and immediately thought of her. That part wasn't surprising. The surprising part was what came next. I smiled, then felt sad, then felt grateful, then felt sad again, all within maybe 10 seconds. And standing there beside a shelf full of cereal boxes, I realized something. My emotional world had become larger, more complicated, more nuanced. Not easier, just bigger. And strangely enough, that felt like growth. Not because it was comfortable, because it was real. Before intimacy, I tended to categorize emotions. Good, bad, useful, and necessary, manageable, inconvenient. After intimacy, things became less organized, more layered. I could miss someone and appreciate them simultaneously. Feel grateful and regretful simultaneously. Feel relief and loss simultaneously. And while that sounds obvious, it wasn't obvious to me at the time. Because complexity requires emotional maturity, not perfection. Tolerance. The ability to sit with contradiction without immediately trying to resolve it. That's another thing intimacy unlocks. The capacity to tolerate emotional complexity. Not master it. Tolerate it. There's a difference. I still remember a late-night conversation with myself. One of those conversations that happens when sleep refuses to arrive. The room was dark. The clock set to 14 a.m. and my thoughts were moving in circles. Eventually, I found myself asking, "Do you actually miss her?" The answer came immediately. Yes. Then another question appeared. "Do you want to reach out?" Silence. Long silence. Because the answer wasn't simple. Part of me did. Part of me didn't. Part of me wanted connection. Part of me wanted protection. Part of me wanted closure. Part of me wanted possibility. And suddenly I realized something. Not every question has one answer. Some questions contain multiple truths. That realization sounds small. It wasn't. Because I had spent years believing emotions should make sense. Intimacy taught me they often don't. At least not in neat ways. Sometimes a man can genuinely love someone and still pull away. Sometimes he can understand what he needs and still struggle to ask for it. Sometimes he can recognize his fears and still obey them. Awareness doesn't automatically create transformation. That's another myth people believe. Just because he sees the pattern doesn't mean he instantly changes it. Sometimes he repeats it again and again and again while fully understanding what he's doing. That reality can be difficult to accept, especially for people who want growth to look dramatic. Most growth is painfully ordinary. It's catching yourself, noticing, adjusting, failing, trying again, realizing something months later than you wish you had. I think intimacy also unlocks accountability. Not the harsh kind, the honest kind. The kind where he eventually stops blaming every outcome on circumstances. Stops blaming timing. Stops blaming distance. Stops blaming bad luck. And starts asking harder questions. What role did I play? What was I avoiding? What truth did I already know? What conversation did I postpone? What feeling did I refuse to acknowledge? Those questions rarely feel empowering. Mostly they feel uncomfortable. But they matter. Because accountability is where emotional adulthood begins. Not perfection. Responsibility. There was a moment I remember vividly. I was listening to an old voice message. Something I hadn't heard in a long time. And as I listened, I noticed something strange. I wasn't focusing on her words anymore. I was focusing on my reactions. The things I missed. The things I misunderstood. The things I wasn't emotionally available enough to hear at the time. And suddenly I realized something. Deep intimacy had changed the way I listened. Not just to her, to everyone. Because once you've experienced being genuinely understood, you begin understanding the value of understanding others. Not theoretically, practically. You notice things, tone changes, pauses, and spoken feelings. The things hiding underneath the words. And while that awareness can be painful, it's also meaningful. I think that's what intimacy ultimately unlocks. Not certainty. Sensitivity, not perfection. Presence, not enlightenment. Depth, the ability to feel more, notice more, recognize more. And yes, that comes with costs. More awareness means more vulnerability. More awareness means fewer places to hide. More awareness means confronting parts of yourself you'd rather ignore. But it also means becoming more human. More emotionally alive, more connected to your own experience. And that's not always a dramatic transformation. Sometimes it's incredibly ordinary. Sometimes it looks like pausing before sending a defensive message. Sometimes it looks like admitting you're hurt instead of pretending you're angry. Sometimes it looks like finally saying, "I miss you," even if only to yourself. Maybe that's the truth nobody talks about. Deep intimacy doesn't unlock a perfect man. It doesn't create certainty. It doesn't erase fear. It doesn't magically resolve old wounds. What it unlocks is awareness. And awareness changes everything. Not because it immediately fixes anything. Because once a man truly sees himself, he can never fully return to not seeing. He can avoid, delay, distract himself, pretend for a while, but somewhere inside him, the awareness remains. Quiet, patient, waiting, and eventually, whether he likes it or not, that awareness begins shaping the man he becomes. Not through grand revelations, not through dramatic breakthroughs, but through hundreds of small moments where honesty becomes slightly easier than denial. And in the end, that may be the most meaningful thing deep intimacy ever unlocks. Not who he loves, but who he becomes capable of being when he finally stops running from himself. I think the final truth arrives quietly. Not during the relationship. Not during the arguments. Not during the moments everyone expects. Usually much later. long after the emotional noise settles, long after the explanations stop working, long after the distractions lose their effectiveness. And that's probably why so many men miss it at first. Because the truth he usually admits last isn't about her. At least not entirely. It's about himself. It's about what actually changed. I used to think the hardest part of deep intimacy was losing someone. Now I'm not so sure. I think sometimes the hardest part is realizing how much they changed you. Because that's difficult to measure. There isn't a date for it. There isn't a clear moment. No dramatic event marks the transition. One day you're living your life. Then one day you realize you're not the same person who entered the experience. And somehow that realization feels both beautiful and painful. I remember a random Saturday morning. Nothing important was happening. I was making coffee, half awake, standing in my kitchen. The kind of ordinary moment nobody remembers. And for reasons I still can't fully explain, I suddenly thought about her. Not intensely, not emotionally, just briefly, like a memory passing through. Then another thought followed. A strange thought. I don't miss her the same way anymore. That realization surprised me, because for a long time, missing her had felt heavy, constant, present. But now something had shifted. The ache was different, softer, quieter, less demanding. And that's when another realization arrived. I wasn't grieving her anymore. I was understanding her. Or maybe understanding what she represented. And those aren't the same thing. Sometimes it takes years to separate them. I think many men eventually discover this. The person who impacted them most wasn't necessarily the person they spent the most time with. It wasn't always the longest relationship, or the most stable one, or even the one that worked. Sometimes it was simply the person who forced them to meet themselves. And that's a much harder thing to forget, because eventually memories change. Faces blur, conversations fade, details disappear, but self-recognition stays. The version of himself she revealed remains. And that's where the final truth often lives. Not in the relationship itself, in what it exposed. I remember a conversation with an older man years ago. We were talking about relationships. The ones that stay with you. The ones that don't. The ones that change you. At some point, he said something I didn't understand at the time. He said, "You spend years thinking you miss the person." Then he paused. "You eventually realize you miss who you became around them." At the time, I thought that sounded poetic. Now I think it sounded accurate. Because there is a version of a man that only emerges in certain connections. A version that laughs differently, feels differently, opens differently. And when the connection changes, he sometimes spends years trying to understand what exactly disappeared. Was it her? Was it the relationship? Was it the future he imagined? Or was it a version of himself? The answer is usually complicated. It's usually all of them. That's the thing about real emotional experiences. They refuse simple explanations. One of the hardest truths arrives when he finally stops blaming timing. I think a lot of men hide there for a while. Timing, circumstances, distance, life, responsibilities, bad luck. Those explanations feel comforting because they're external. External explanations preserve identity. They allow him to believe there was nothing else he could have done. Sometimes that's true. Sometimes it isn't. And eventually, if he's honest enough, a difficult question appears. What part of this was me? Not in a self-destructive way. Not in a shame-based way. Just honestly, what part of this belonged to me? The answer can be uncomfortable. Sometimes he realizes he knew how he felt much earlier than he admitted. Sometimes he realizes fear made more decisions than he wanted to acknowledge. Sometimes he realizes he waited too long to say certain things. Sometimes he realizes he understood her more than he acted like he did. And sometimes he realizes she mattered more than he ever said out loud. That realization often arrives late, painfully late, months later, years later, in moments nobody would expect. Driving home, folding laundry, standing in line somewhere, listening to a song, and suddenly the truth appears without warning. Not dramatic, just undeniable. She mattered more than I admitted, more than I understood, more than I allowed myself to recognize. And strangely, there's relief in finally admitting it, because denial requires effort. Honesty eventually becomes easier. I think one of the most human experiences is realizing something after it's no longer useful. We all do it. We understand conversations after they end. We understand relationships after they change. We understand people after they leave. And we spend years wondering why clarity has such terrible timing. Maybe that's just how emotional understanding works. Maybe some lessons require distance. Maybe some truths need silence before they can be heard. I don't know. I'm less certain about things than I used to be. That's another thing intimacy changed. It made me less absolute, less convinced, less interested in simple answers. Because people are complicated. Love is complicated. Fear is complicated. Growth is complicated. Sometimes he misses her. Sometimes he doesn't. Sometimes he feels grateful. Sometimes he feels regret. Sometimes both happen in the same afternoon. Human emotions don't follow linear timelines. They move in circles. They revisit places. They return unexpectedly, then disappear again. I remember opening an old conversation one night, not because I was struggling, not because I wanted something, just curiosity. I read a few messages, smiled, closed the app, and what surprised me wasn't sadness. It was appreciation. For a long time, I thought emotional maturity meant reaching a place where nothing affected you anymore. Now, I think it means something else. I think it means being able to remember without needing to return. Being able to appreciate without needing to possess. Being able to acknowledge impact without demanding continuation. That's harder than people realize, especially for men who spent years treating emotions like problems to solve. Some experiences aren't problems. They're chapters. Important chapters. Life-changing chapters. But still chapters. And perhaps that's the final truth. The connection was never only about the relationship. It was about the transformation. Not transformation in some grand, dramatic sense. The quieter kind. The human kind. The kind where a man becomes slightly more honest. Slightly more aware. Slightly more capable of intimacy. Slightly less afraid of being seen. The kind of growth nobody notices from the outside. Because it happens internally. In small moments. Private moments. Moments that never become stories. There are still times when he thinks about reaching out. People rarely admit that. But it's true. Not always because he wants the relationship back. Sometimes because he wants to acknowledge the impact. Sometimes because gratitude has nowhere to go. Sometimes because unfinished feelings occasionally knock on old doors. Most of the time, he doesn't send the message. Not because he doesn't care. Because life has moved. Because people have changed. Because not every feeling requires action. That's another lesson intimacy teaches. The feeling can be real even if the action never happens. The love can be real even if the story changes. The impact can be real even if the connection doesn't continue. And eventually he sits with that. Not perfectly, not gracefully, just honestly, which may be the most honest thing he's done all along. Because the final truth isn't that she saved him. She didn't. The final truth isn't that she completed him. She didn't. The final truth isn't even that she was the love of his life. Maybe she was. Maybe she wasn't. The final truth is simpler and somehow heavier. She changed the way he experiences himself. She changed what he notices, what he feels, what he avoids, what he values. She changed the conversations he has with himself when nobody else is around, and whether they speak again or never do, whether they end up together or don't, whether the story continues or remains unfinished, that impact remains, quietly, permanently, not as an obsession, not as a wound, not even as a longing, as recognition. The recognition that some people arrive in your life and leave behind more than memories. They leave behind awareness. And years later, when the room is quiet and life has finally settled, he understands something he couldn't understand before. The person who unlocked the most in him may never fully know what she awakened. And perhaps that's the most human ending of all. Not certainty, not reunion, not closure. Just a quiet man standing in an ordinary moment of his life, finally admitting a truth he spent years trying to outrun. It mattered. She mattered. And so did the man he became because of it.
Thank you for spending this moment with me. If this message resonated with your soul, remember to subscribe and continue this journey with us here on Twin Flame Journey. And always remember, what is meant for your soul will always find its way back to you. Until next time, beautiful soul, trust the journey.